Welcome to the Lazy CEO Podcast, where Jim Schleckser, author of Great CEOs Are Lazy and founder of the CEO Project, features compelling experts and topics for CEOs of mid to large-size companies. Now, let's get started with the show.
Welcome, everybody, to another Lazy CEO podcast. My name is Jim Schleckser. I am your host and the founder of the CEO Project. Well, one of the things that we've talked a couple times about is, liquidity event, and potentially as we, as entrepreneurs, build our business to a certain scale, liquidity event, that's something that we may want to consider. Now, last time we talked a little bit about IPOs, which I think is a very niche choice of a liquidity event, but right for some people. And today we're going to kind of go back into the thinking about a liquidity event, thinking about prepping, going through the process and so forth, but a little more broadly this time. And we have with us, luckily, an expert on the topic. We have with us Laurie Barkman from the Business Transition Sherpa. Welcome, Laurie.
Hey, thanks, Jim. I'm so glad to be with you this morning.
Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. And I always loved the Sherpa thing because ever since I read In Thin Air by John Krakauer, I've always loved like mountaineering books. And so I love the Sherpa analogy. So tell me how you got into the business of Sherpa-ing entrepreneurs through a transition process. What got you into that business?
Yeah, it started when I went through an M&A process as a CEO. I was hired in from the outside to run a division of let's say $1 billion plus revenue company. And my role was part of a long-term succession plan. So I was running a division, and this was a 125-year-old third generation company in the transportation logistics space. And the experience was amazing. There was an offer kind of from out of the blue. Right? We call it the Bluebird. The Bluebird came flying in and said, "We've been watching your company for the last 6-7 years. We're interested in acquiring the entire business." So not just my group, but the whole company. And it was a really exciting process and challenging and emotional and all those things. And as one of the key executives, becoming part of not only, the M&A process, the integration thereafter, and then joining the much, much larger global entity for a period of time was an amazing learning experience. Again, goods, bads, challenges, all the way. And so thereafter in my career, I decided that I want to stay close to the entrepreneur. I want to stay close to the CEO and the C-suite and help them grow their business and create value. And then also manage the transition process, because it's so tricky and it's so fraught with emotion and decision-making. And the Sherpa analogy, thank you for acknowledging that. It is an homage that this is a process and this is a journey. And I have a framework and I have tools and I have some of my experiences and I have lots of things that can help you, including my Rolodex. So let's work together. Let's work together on this big thing that I call transition.
Nice. So I've probably done 30 or 40 transactions myself, buy side, sell side. And, whenever we get involved in one, when I'm talking to a seller, we actually advise them to get really good advice because, look, this is probably the largest financial transaction of your life. This is the first time you've ever done it. And I get that you're super smart, but there's 1,000 things that can go wrong. You need help. Go get really good help to bring you through the process. So I love what you're doing because I think it's incredibly valuable to help guide people through. You don't want to walk through the landmine field the first time. You want help when you do that. So I love that. So how early do you get involved? And maybe the better way to ask the question is, how early should we start thinking about a transition as entrepreneurs? Let's say I'm X age and I'm thinking, maybe I'll give you a specific example. We've got a member that we work with. I think he's 61. He's sort of thinking that he'll transition 65, 6, something like, kind of depends on how the tea leaves lay down. But is that too early? And what should he be thinking about at that stage?
This is such a great question. I love the question. And let's take the time to unpack it because there's no one answer. In this particular scenario, let's talk about it. And here we have a scenario, the gentleman's 61 and he's thinking, 65. So we have about 4 years.
Maybe, if some
Maybe.
have earlier or later, he's not like hard
Yeah.
date, right?
So my first comment is that there's age and there's life stage. In this particular example, I'd call it more of an age scenario.
Okay.
And it's very common in the US for a lot of, let's say, if I can call it the baby boomer generation, to think about the Social Security, the 65, the 67, whatever is that common number we all think about for quote unquote retirement. Very, very common that people in the baby boomer generation think about age. I'll retire when I'm blank old. That happens a lot. For those people, I would say the best time to have started would have been yesterday. The next best time is today. 4 years is going to come in the blink of an eye. And as we have things change in our life that we don't control, like our health and our family status of their health, right? And sometimes we have partner issues in the company, like dissolution or one of my clients, the partner was stealing. So you have partner challenges that you might be facing, things that we don't control necessarily that can cause a challenge in the value of our business and also impact how we'll transition our company. And the less runway of time we have, the more challenging it can be to resolve some of those issues and rebuild if needed. So in this particular scenario where the individual has maybe 4 years, it's actually not that much time. Because the other question I get a lot, Jim, is, well, how much time does it take? And of course, the answer is, well, it really depends because it depends on the starting point. So whether it's contingency planning for how we might mitigate some of these outside risks that we don't control through buy-sell agreements or other things, whether it's the growth planning side of what do we need to do to continue to build and enhance value, or it's the succession side, and I'll branch succession in 2 ways, succession of leadership or succession of ownership. Whoa, that all of a sudden sounds like a lot to accomplish, especially if the owner is thinking the best fit buyer is not a related party. And a related party can be management and insiders, or it could also literally be related people. If it's a third party, it takes even longer.
In that case, it is. It's a multi-generational family business. It's transition to the next generation, G4, I guess, in this case. So that is what he's thinking. And that's got its own complication because it's a pretty valuable company. And the kid, I mean, he's in his 30s, but he's a kid. He doesn't have that kind of money. So now what do we do, right?
Yeah,
so,
exactly. And the kid, Junior, if we can just say it that way.
Oh my God, we shouldn't call him. Let's just say the son in this case.
The son, but I'm going to generalize too, because I obviously don't know the client, but I'll generalize. And I have one of my own clients in this situation with 3 juniors. They have 3 children that they're contemplating for potential succession of ownership.
Right.
And the process that we're going through with my client is taking a little bit of time. And why that is because I'm spending some time with the next gen to understand, well, what are they doing today? What are their interests? And what's their capability is the next question. And we're going to put some diagnostics in place to help us get some objective data around that. And then collectively say, is there a fit or not? And that doesn't still answer all the questions. I think there's capability, there's interest, and then there's the ownership mindset and the risk tolerance as an owner. And then of course there's the financial factors of can they, how do we create the mechanics of that transition, whether it's gifting or buying in or what have you. It's so complicated. And so that's to your point earlier, how much time does this take? Wow, we've got to give this space and time, because what if the next gen isn't the right fit for whatever reason?
Right.
You need a plan B, and you've got to give yourself enough runway to execute plan B before you run out of time.
And we've seen that before where hired guns are brought in, until G2, G3, G4 are ready, because there is the skill and the will question that you mentioned, right? Do you have the skill to do the job? Do you have the want, the will to do it? Or would you rather just own it and collect money? That's okay too. There's nothing wrong with that answer. It's a fine answer. Interesting. So, I actually wrote an article about, there is no retirement, particularly when you work with your mind, right? Retirement conceptually is for when you wore your body out. well, none of like you, me, we're not going to wear our body, hopefully wear our bodies out, maybe playing, but not working. So when am I not going to be able to work or do some kind of work? I don't know, when I don't have the energy for it. And I have no idea what that number is going to be. So, but you talked about company life cycles too, as an alternative way of thinking about transition. Why don't you run us down that trail for a little bit?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's life cycle for you as a person, and it's life
Right.
cycle of the company. And let's take the company side. I think this is such an interesting concept that let's look at companies as if they were people.
Yep.
And there's wonderful work by Itzhak Adizes, who in his consulting practice talks a lot about this content. So I'm kind of borrowing from him, if you will.
Yep.
But it's the concept that organizations are living organisms, and they have an infant stage known as a startup, and they go through the toddlers and the challenges of the stinky diaper, and our product isn't wanted in the market and we got to start over, and adolescence to maturity, which we'll kind of visualize here, a bell curve. And this is nice and green. We color it green. It's feeling good. We're on that upside. And then the other side of this bell curve is in red.
Yep.
And that's the death valley. And when we hit an area called the fall, that's when we're on this other side of the life cycle and maturity cycle. So of course, we're talking about companies that have probably been around at least 5 years, at least 10 years. You know, startups, if they're going to hit the fall, they're going to hit it early, right?
Yep.
They'll know. But if they get to a certain size, they get to a certain sophistication in the management and the leadership, and there's so many issues, as you can imagine, and challenges for companies that are reaching a stage called prime. They've hit this wonderful spot, which is the teams are aligned. They've gotten over the issues of the changeover from the founder to a more professional, I don't want to say more professional, that's not the way I would say it, to a professional management team beyond the founder, or if it's a family business, they've successfully, transitioned to the next gen, and there's changes all abound. When a company reaches that other side to the fall, a common question I get is it possible to come back? Can you come back from the fall and avoid the abyss of eventually liquidating or closing? And it's possible to do that. Innovation is a big way that companies can come back from the fall. It's not an easy thing to do, because the fall, when you're in it, what's really hard about the fall, Jim, is you might not know, because your numbers still look really good.
Sure.
What's happening on the inside, it's almost like this cancer is blooming and you don't know it's there, and it's eating your culture alive. It's when you're more insular, you don't really care about the outside world. An extreme example is our agenda is perfect and color coded, and we don't really care what our customers are thinking. We're not talking enough outside our four walls. And so the market starts to disrupt us. We don't see it. And what was a cash cow becomes a challenge. That's the fall, and that feels terrible. So if our company is in that situation, does the next gen want that? If the next gen sees that the baton they're about to take is going to take them down a very challenging path, do they want that? Look in the mirror. Realistically, that's a very challenging situation for the next gen. And
Yep.
that might be why, from a life stage company, I just launched one of my shows. I have a show called Succession Stories. And the most recent episode was why your kids want your money and not your business.
Yeah. Yep.
And
Sure.
so that can happen,
There are a couple of books that talk to this cycles thing. There's Evolution and Revolution as Companies Grow. There's Hubris Before the Fall by Collins. You're kind of speaking to all of that. And, I as an eternal optimist and entrepreneur, I dispute the premise that it is a natural and required process. In other words, there's always a way to scallop the curve, right? And we think about normal growth trajectories. They aren't these beautiful, smooth curves. They're, go up, go flat for a while as we're figuring it out. And then we scallop it, and then we screw up. And we talk about this as constraints in the business, right? This is back to Goldrat's theory of constraints. And the idea is that in any system you can name, there's a point of constraint that limits it. Until you remove the point of constraint, you'll slow or stop your growth. Once you bust your point of constraint, you go back to growth. So your idea of, maturity, I go, well, fair enough, but there's a diagnostic, right, of why that's occurring. And if we can deal with it, we can go back to growth and then scalp. But you may not want to do that, right? I think there's another angle here, which is, and this is talked about in No Man's Land by Doug Tatum. He talked about the idea that there are structural elements in industries. So, for example, logistics, the industry you were in, there are lots of $10 and $20 million logistic businesses. But get to 100, you need to invest in systems, like real money in systems. And if you've got a $20 million business, you go like, do I really want to invest $2, $3, $4, $5 million in the systems to become a competitive $100 million company? Answer no, I'll let the next person deal with that. Right. So those are other things we've seen as reasons why somebody might want to go. So let's sneak up a little closer to transaction, right? We've done some work. We think we know who the buyer is. We cleaned up our systems and our books, but there's something facing us that we just don't want to deal with, either life or in the business. And it's time for the next set of hands to take this thing on. Then what? I know I'm out. Now what?
Yeah, and this is where a lot of people struggle, and there's a fear of what's next because they haven't given themselves the mental training or the mental energy to, dedicate to this conclusion of, well, what will I do after I leave the company? And
Right.
that's why I like, I talk about 100% of business owners are going to leave their company one day, but very, very few are prepared right now. And
Yeah.
these owners are going to leave either horizontally or vertically. And I'm
Yeah.
sure you've seen, Jim, the stories, which are kind of sad, that the 80, 90-year-old person is dying at his desk. And it's because they do not have a life outside of the business. And it's I think something that some people talk about when you're going to say you retire and you're writing an email to the universe that you're basically ready to, sort of keel off. I don't believe that that's true either. I think that we can have life outside of what we're doing today. It doesn't need to lead us into depression. It doesn't need to lead us into, even a worse thing, which is the suicide rates amongst white male executives is a high number, frankly.
Really? I've never heard
Yes.
that before. Wow.
Yeah, and it's sad. It doesn't need to be that way. But I think a big reason, whether you're an owner, founder, or a key executive who this is what you've known for a very long time, we can think about why that might be. One reason is because family businesses, especially, or if you're the founder and your name is on the door, your identity is so tied in and it's been that way for a long time. It's really hard to uncouple that, especially if from a social standpoint, your social relationships, your weddings, your birthdays, it's involving lots of folks from the business. If you're not part of that business anymore, that can feel like a very lonely space. And you fear that disconnection. There's lots of other things that can give us regret after we leave our business. I think identity is probably the one that I cover most as number one for the reasons I've talked about. And it is something that we can work on starting now. It can be about many things. It can be the roles that you play outside of work. Let's articulate what those are. You are a parent, you're a sibling, you're an aunt or an uncle, you're a friend, you are involved in your community in some way or the religious institution you belong to. Whatever those roles are, let's articulate what they are. And let's articulate why they're important to you and maybe what role you want to play in the future if you had more control of your time. I think time is the biggest commodity we can't get back. And so how we choose to spend our time and thinking about personal readiness and personal transition, let's not wait to do the personal exit planning when we're exiting because it's just too late. Let's give ourselves the time and space to do that now.
When we've got clients that are heading this way, I talk about, tell me what's going to pull you out of this business. All right. You've got to create something that's so compelling that you want to do next that you go like, I really can't wait to sell this business because I can't wait to do that. Whatever the thing is, teach, chase my grandchildren around, whatever it is. I don't care, travel. But until you have that, you'll have the void that you talked about. And, we talk about, Jim 2.0 or 3.0. What is that makes you want to go? I think that's really important. Build that runway ahead of time. So as we head towards evaluate, and let's not think family, let's think we're probably going to sell in this case. What would be the 6 to 8 things I should be thinking about that are going to drive value? Because obviously we want to relatively maximize, maybe not, suck every nickel out of it, but at least relatively maximize the outcome that we get. What would be the 5, 6, 7 things that we should be focused on that will drive valuation in a transaction?
In general, for any industry, there's 8 core drivers that any company should be able to relate to or think about for their business. So I'll run through all 8 at a high level, and I'm happy to dive into any of them deeper if you want. The first one is financial performance. So it is the absolute results of your numbers. What is the profitability? What is the revenue? And those absolute numbers, as well as doing adjustments. If you were no longer part of the business, what would your adjusted EBITDA look like, or your seller discretionary earnings? It's not only that. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I stop you there for a second? We get some people that are really focused on revenue over profit. Do you have a view on revenue versus profit as a driver of ultimate transaction value?
I do, and it's related to some of the other drivers. So I'll answer your
Okay.
question in that manner, because I think it all stitches together
Fair
really
enough.
well. Just a couple other points on financial performance, because these are some nuances that if people are recognizing today can really help them. Regardless of whatever size your business is, let's say, and just on the revenue, it's under 2 million, it's under 5, under 10, under 20, under 50, under 100. The larger you are, the more complex the business is, and the chances are the larger companies are going to have outside resources preparing financial reports. And if you have audited financials, that's the ideal, and that's a great thing to have. But there's also a cost to that. And I don't say every client needs to have audited financials. But one thing to recognize is the consistency of your reporting and the quality of your reporting does matter. So regardless of what size company you are, please be mindful of that, whether you're using QuickBooks or an outside firm for that. And a reviewed financial statement can be a really powerful tool as well. You don't have to have audited financials. So size also matters. That question comes up a lot. The answer is yes, it does. And I've seen some data that shows an inflection point on multiples for companies with revenue 25 million plus in the United States. And a big reason for that are some of the things we'll talk about here in a moment. The biggest thing to understand when it comes to the financials, again, is your absolute numbers, and also, recognizing you're being compared to peers in your industry. So your industry, for certain, will have industry standard multiples that we might see in the data. And then also the region that you're in can impact. So the industry you serve, your multiple, the industry you serve, your geography, your absolute performance on revenue, and some other factors in your business, and then the comparatives in your industry. So that's one thing. I'm bundling that into one thing. And that's a big one. It's typically number one for a reason.
Sure.
The second thing is growth potential. And growth potential is about your demonstrated ability to show growth in the future for the buyer. Because what does the buyer care about? If it's a financial buyer, and strategics too, but they care about the predictability of future cash flow. So the predictability of future cash flow is more predictable for companies like Netflix, or the software company where you're happy to put your credit card in and you've got a subscription model, which is the third driver, which is the recurring revenue model. Recurring revenue, not reoccurring with an O, just to differentiate. So growth potential is this demonstrated ability for your company to grow and deliver, and the buyer will capitalize on that growth potential. So if you're going after the Fortune 500 and you have 498, they only have 2 to go. But if you've captured 2 of the 500 and they can go capture the 498 with some certainty, that's very exciting.
Yeah. We always talk about, first of all, I'm a huge fan of recurring revenue. We actually dealt with one private equity firm that had bumper stickers printed up. They were about monthly recurring revenue, right? MMR or MRR. And they had I heart MRR, right? Because basically that was their whole investment thesis. You've got lots of MRR, we're interested in buying your company. But also when we talk about selling, we go, look, you need to leave some sizzle on the steak, right? You can't take it all off the table and say, hey, you figure it out. You have to say, look, there's these 3 or 4 opportunities I haven't gotten to, but you can once you buy it if you want them, right? So we're totally aligned with that line of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why growth potential is really, really important, because you got to put yourself in the shoes of the buyer. What is it that your company solves as a pain point for them? And one thing I want everybody to be clear about, when you're not in the room, if you're the seller, you know what the buyers are talking about? They're talking about if they can replicate your business, how much it will cost them to do it, and in what time frame.
Sure.
So the more clear you are on your story as to what pain points you're solving and how you do that, is part of this overall pitch, right? So the tie-in with recurring revenue is critical. And to differentiate in your own mind, reoccurring means there's no contract, maybe there's a handshake, and the risk associated with reoccurring, no contract or a handshake, is because if you're not there, what happens with that relationship? So it all dials back to what are the risks for the buyer, which leads to the fourth one, which is what we call the Switzerland structure. And the Switzerland structure is a recognition of risk around three core areas: customers, suppliers, and employees. Let's look in the mirror on employees. You could be part of the risk factors. Do you have key person insurance? What are these things that we might not be thinking about in terms of a buy-sell agreement if we don't have one in place? What the aspects of employee retention, how is our company performing? What's our culture? I can go on and on and on about the employee side. There's things we can do to try to mitigate those risks. But number one is be a great manager, that be someone people want to work for. The others are, we kind of hit on with customers. The customer side is really about revenue risk. If you have revenue percent of total, where one customer represents more than 15%, 20% of total, that can be perceived as a risk to the buyer. And they're going to kind of circle that and want to understand it and is there a contract in place? Is that contract transferable? And so the transferability of assets, as we talk about risk, is related to all of this, because I've sort of emphasized this a few times, that buyers want something that they can capitalize on. And if there's risk associated with you as the owner and relationships or other things, they're going to discount your company, right? So cash flow is related also, and this is number 5, because there's an inverse relationship between the cash flow needs of the business and the multiples that we might see, right? There's sort of this teeter-totter relationship. Other value drivers include what we call monopoly control. And really this at its core is about competitive differentiation. Right. What makes your company's value proposition? What is different, special, and how have we validated that? There's been a lot of shifting tectonic plates in the market because of COVID and other technology changes, right? We're living in a very dynamic market, many of us. And if we haven't kept up with that, we talked about the company life cycle earlier. If your very mature company has not kept up with some of these market dynamics, you may find your business falling behind. So competitive differentiation is also a recognition that we might need to be continuing to innovate on products and services. And then the last two that I'll cover are kind of in an interesting relationship with each other. One is customer satisfaction. You talked about SaaS businesses and MRR, absolutely. And in my book, the Business Transition Handbook, I talk about some other metrics. If you do have a very high percent of revenue that's recurring revenue, measurements around your CAC, which is your customer acquisition cost, your LTV, which is your lifetime value, and the ratio between those two. Is it a 3-to-1? Is it a 4-to-1? And what's normal for your industry? And what's your cost of acquisition as a number? How that plays into your marketing? Well, the higher your retention, right, the lower your churn. So those are related, and we're going to want to see those. And we're also going to want to understand, what does your marketing look like, and what does it take? Do you have a flywheel going on your marketing and sales, and can you generate customers at a lower acquisition cost over time, which is an indication of scale. When it comes to small businesses and business owners, we get a lot of pride. My understanding is we get a lot of pride from the relationships that we've built with our customers. We want the handshake deal. It makes us feel good that we have that relationship with our suppliers or customers. But again, that represents risk for the buyer if you're not there, which is why the last one, which is number 8, is so critical. We call this the hub and spoke. And the hub and spoke business has the owner in the center. They're the ones that know where to kick the machine to get it to run just the right way. They're answering the questions. They're putting out the fires internally, externally, and they're needed, which feels good. And that fuels that identity piece of what we spoke about, of why I'm so needed in this business. And there's a psychology to that I don't want to leave. I don't want to separate. They need me. And then there's this inverse relationship. So the more we know our customers, we might get higher scores on customer satisfaction, but then we're going to get a lower score on owner dependency. Right. Or, they're flipped around, a lower hub and spoke score, which means a high owner dependency. And so, I just threw a lot at you, but those are the 8 core drivers of what constitutes business value beyond financials.
Nice. A couple of those points I really resonated to. One was the, Warren Buffett calls it moats.
Yes.
Right. You want to build when given a choice of growing your business or extending the size of the moat around your business, making it more defensible, extend the moat every time.
Yes.
And so that was really your concept of protectability of the business, right? How protected is your business model? How replicable is your business model? When you leave the room and they have that little debate, they go, yeah, no way, we can't do it. You're in a better position in negotiating. But also the concept of hub and spoke, we use the analogy of a old time switchboard operator. I mean, these pictures of, it was mostly women in those days, but, where they'd be connecting phone calls with these plugs into connecting to Mr. Smith, Mr. Jones, Mr. whatever. Well, you can work faster, but at some point there's a limit, right? There's a rate determining, which is you. So if all decisions go through you, you need to connect all the phone calls, in a way of speaking, you've limited the growth potential of the business, clearly, because there's not enough of you. All right. I talked to one potential member, and he was doing this. And he's working 60 hours a week. I'm like, okay, so if you double the company, are you going to work 120 hours a week? Is that sort of the plan here? And obviously the answer is can't be done, and therefore you're not going to grow the way you'd like to. Let's just take 1 second to touch on what happens afterwards. How can we be happy with the outcome, right? We sold it. We went through, I'm not going to go through all the terms and conditions and negotiating the contract. We're in maybe another day, but after I've done the transaction, money shows up in my account. Now what?
Yeah, this is why I talked about personal planning earlier. The more we've developed a personal plan prior to a transaction, then we can put that in place and start to execute and not start the next cycle of planning and wondering what I'm going to do after I get my feet off the beach. And I saw this with the company that I was a part of. They set up a family office for investing, and they set up a separate entity that invests in causes they care about. So they had 2 branches. They had staffed it accordingly and developed their mission, and the family was really excited to dive into that, and it really gave them new purpose. And so whatever you decide is right for you or your family after the transaction, my encouragement would be to start to develop that runway so that when the transaction happens, this pull factor, this something pulling you to your next thing that you're really excited about, and that's going to give you a new sense of purpose and identity.
Nice. That's great. Beyond, creating the foundation or the charity or donor advised fund, whatever the model is you happen to pick, many of our, particularly have had a big significant liquidity event. The first thing they do is they get a jet card. It's like, I'm done traveling commercial, as if they had a big enough transaction. And then they join one of these clubs that have fancy houses all over the world. And then they start, with great, by the way, with their significant other, with their grandkids, with their, plan 3, 4, 5 amazing vacations. That'll only get you so far, but it's a good sort of soft landing, frankly.
Yeah, I call that the trophy. Everybody should have a trophy, whether it's it's the Lamborghini, it's the travel on the jet, it's the trip with the fam. That's amazing, and you deserve it, and you should do something like that to celebrate and kind of take a breather. Some people really benefit by having just some time. They feel like they need to rest and, rejuvenate themselves mentally, physically, because it's exhausting. You've been running your business, you're doing this transaction, there's a lot on your shoulders, and you might be in your head a lot and feeling like you just can't share it all, and it can feel like a lonely place. So celebrate, you deserve it, and then jump back into whatever is pulling you forward and be excited about that.
Phenomenal. Well, Laurie, this was great. You're just a font of knowledge. I really appreciate all the insight you've got. Obviously, you're a pro at this. What if people wanted to get a little more Laurie in their life? How would they do that?
Oh, thanks, Jim. It'd be an honor to connect with your audience if they want to reach out. They can find me on LinkedIn. That's pretty easy. Please let me know that you heard about me on the Lazy CEO podcast. And they can connect with me on my website. There's lots of resources there too. So they can set up time with me directly. They can email me, Laurie@thebusinesstransitionssherpa.com. They can find my podcast, my book, and my new course that I'm launching, which I'm really excited about, all on my website, thebusinesstransitionssherpa.com. And the Succession Stories podcast is another thing. If they want to check that out, that would be an honor to me. And you can find it wherever you listen and on YouTube. So I'm out there.
Phenomenal. Not hard to find is the answer.
Not hard to find.
Awesome, Laurie. Well, thanks again. I wish you a really good day and good luck in the future. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Jim.
Alrighty. This podcast is brought to you by the CEO Project. At the CEO Project, we work with CEOs to help them grow their business. And our members represent billions of dollars of revenue and profit. And frankly, amongst all of us, we've probably made every mistake in the book, including some you haven't made yet. So if you want to learn from the experience of a bunch of really seasoned CEOs, we're a great place to hang out. In this podcast, what you're going to hear are some of those ideas, concepts, and things that are just going to help you on your journey. If you want to find out more, reach out to us at theceoproject.com, or you can contact me personally at jim@theceoproject.com. Happy listening.
Thanks for listening to the Lazy CEO podcast. We'll see you next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes, and check out our website, www.theceoproject.com.